Saddle up and head 'em off at the pass in this rip-roaring, Wild West adventure, Bushwhack Range. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a single posse. Bushwhack Range. Rip and the girl nudged their mounts forward, the horses' hooves crunching softly against the sun-baked earth. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and the faint tang of distant rain, though no clouds marred the vast azure expanse above. The man riding beside them, his face weathered by years of wind and sun, gestured ahead with a calloused hand. "Couple miles," he said, his voice rough but amiable like the bark of an old cottonwood. "Just over that hill, off to the left. Buffalo City, if you're keen on the name." "Names mean nothing," Rip grinned, his teeth flashing white against his sun-darkened skin. His eyes, a piercing blue, scanned the horizon with the keenness of a man who had spent his life reading the land. "Just looking for a job." They rode on, the rhythmic creak of leather and the occasional snort of the horses breaking the stillness. The stranger, curious and conversational, soon learned that Rip's home range was Arizona, a land of endless yellow sage and gaunt, dust-coated cattle. Rip spoke of it with a mix of fondness and weariness, as though the very memory of it weighed on his broad shoulders. "She's dry," Rip said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too many parched years. "Drier than I've seen her in years. Figured I'd head north, see if things were better up here." "Are they?" the man asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp, probing. The girl, riding slightly apart, remained silent, her gray eyes fixed on the distant hills, her expression unreadable. Rip gestured expansively to the rolling green hills that stretched before them, lush and vibrant under the Wyoming sun. The cottonwoods along the creek swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves shimmering like silver coins. "Are they, mister? I'll tell the world." His enthusiasm was infectious, his voice brimming with the kind of hope that only a man who had known hardship could truly appreciate. The man, whose name Rip had yet to learn, allowed a smile to crease his blunt features. He was Rip's age, 26, but his face bore the marks of a life lived hard and without compromise. His jaw, square and stubborn, seemed carved from the same rock as the hills around them. "Sure," he agreed, his voice steady and sure. "No better spot in Wyoming. But that's the trouble. Some folks want too much." "Crowding you, eh?" Rip asked, his tone light but his eyes narrowing slightly, sensing the undercurrent of tension in the man's words. "Crowding ain't strong enough," the man replied, his voice hardening like iron. As they climbed the gentle slope, the land unfolding before them in a patchwork of green and gold, Rip remarked, "Looks like good water country." "You can get water, but not just from a creek," the man said, his words carrying a weight that Rip immediately understood. "Wells and windmills," Rip said, nodding. "That's a chore." "A chore," the girl interjected tartly, her voice sharp and clear like the crack of a whip. "Some men avoid." Rip glanced at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. He had wondered if they were siblings, and now he was sure. She was fair and gray-eyed like the man, with the same short nose and a feminine version of his stubborn chin. There was a fire in her, a determination that matched her brother's, but tempered with a subtle softness that hinted at depths Rip couldn't yet fathom. "Yeah," Rip agreed, his tone thoughtful. "Digging wells is tough." She turned to face him fully, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Then for creek water, how far would you go? Would you burn hay, destroy buildings, cut fences, stampede stock?" Rip looked at her more closely now, sensing the gravity behind her words. "Someone doing that?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "Yes," she said, her tone firm. "Miles Campbell is. Jack and I know." "You don't get Nell's point," Jack broke in, his voice edged with frustration. "Miles Campbell bought the Circle M years ago. A retired rancher on the coast, he didn't check if Cottonwood Creek was his. It wasn't. When I fenced my place, he faced wells. And that started a range war." Rip asked quietly, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together the situation. "Not war," Nell said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "War is open, fair. Campbell methods, Big Ike's methods, are dirty and underhanded. Big Ike Bailey, Jack explained, his jaw tightening as he spoke the name. Is the Circle M foreman. But I was here first, and I'll be here after they're gone, he finished, his voice rising with a fierce determination as they hit Buffalo City's main street. Rip had seen many cowtowns in his time, and they were all much alike, clusters of unpainted buildings rising from the shimmering desolation of the plains. Here, in Buffalo City, the buildings were no different, weathered and worn by the elements. But the cool shade of the cottonwoods and the gentle gurgle of the creek lent the town an air of quiet charm, a welcome respite from the harshness of the open range. Buffalo City had a railroad, a sign of progress that set it apart from other towns. An engine, 2 passenger coaches, and a string of cattle cars stood at the station, their metallic surfaces gleaming in the sunlight. The riders eased past the blacksmith shop and the saloon, their horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust, before stopping at the general store. As Rip dismounted, he noticed 2 cowboys watching them from the porch of the Oasis saloon. Their eyes were sharp and calculating, their postures relaxed but alert. Jack gave them a hard glance, his jaw tightening as he met their gaze. Friends? Rip grinned, his tone light but his eyes wary. The kind you watch, Jack said, his voice low and grim. Coming, Jack? Nell called, her voice carrying a note of urgency as she moved toward the store. Right away, sand in my teeth, Jack said, his eyes still on the cowboys. He looked at Rip. Drink? As Rip followed Jack into the Oasis, he caught Nell's apprehensive look at her brother. Her eyes held a mixture of fear and a strange, almost desperate yearning, as though she were silently pleading with him to be careful. The saloon was nearly empty, its dim interior a stark contrast to the bright sunlight outside. A bow-legged, hard-eyed cowboy stood at the bar, his gaze flicking toward them as they entered. 3 others dozed in chairs against the wall, their hats pulled low over their faces. As Rip and Jack approached, the cowboy at the bar moved away, his movements deliberate and cautious. Jack's lips tightened, but he said nothing. They drank their beer slowly, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Jack finished his drink and set the glass down with a decisive thud. Nell and I have business, he explained, his tone curt. Eat at the Chinks? Sure, Rip said, nodding. I'll see you there. Alone at the bar, Rip watched the cowboy return to his spot. The man's eyes were sharp and calculating, his movements deliberate. Twisting his whiskey glass in his hand, he asked harshly, working for Newton. Talking to me? Rip's tone was low, his eyes narrowing as he met the man's gaze. Yeah, the cowboy grated, his voice rough and challenging. Working for Jack Newton. Any law? Rip countered, his voice calm but edged with steel. The other man glared, his eyes dark with menace. Dunno, but it ain't healthy. Not healthy at all. Ain't healthy, eh? Rip repeated, his voice steady but his hand inching closer to his holster. What am I supposed to do? Act spooky. Rip expected a move, and he wasn't disappointed. The 2 hands from the porch entered the saloon, their boots thudding against the wooden floor. They flanked the bow-legged cowboy, their eyes locked on Rip. Both were in their early 20s, one dark-haired, the other blonde. Twins, Rip thought, looking from one to the other. They stared insolently back, their expressions hard and unyielding. One spoke to the bow-legged cowboy, his voice dripping with mockery. Trouble, Shane? Shane kept his eyes on Rip, chewing his ragged mustache as though it were a piece of tough jerky. No trouble, he allowed, his voice tight. Just telling this hombre, it ain't healthy to work for Jack Newton. The twins looked curiously at Rip, their eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. The dark-haired one gave a brittle laugh, the sound sharp and humorless. Ain't healthy, he almost snarled. It's plumb suicide. Shane smiled wolfishly, his teeth bared in a grimace that was more threat than grin. He don't look like no suicide candidate, not like a ranny who'd cash in for no reason. Rip could take ribbing, but this was more than that. The 3 men were armed and clearly looking for trouble. Rip knew only one way to handle it: meet it head-on. His hand snapped down from the bar, and when it came up, Shane and the twins were staring into the nasty hole of a Colt .45. The saloon fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Rip grinned, his eyes cold and hard. "Fun, eh, gents?" he rasped. "Fun. Now we'll have more fun, my way." The twins weren't laughing now. Shane's face was a dull red, his jaw clenched tight. Slowly, 3 pairs of hands went shoulder-high, their movements cautious and deliberate. Rip waited, his eyes scanning the room. The saloon was silent, but he knew the sleepers were awake, watching. Deliberately, he shoved the gun back into its holster, then spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Let him down," he said, his eyes cold. "I'll take the chance." When they obeyed, he went on, his voice steady but edged with steel. "Me," he admitted, "I ain't good at smart answers. Short of brains, I guess. But if any of you 3, or all of you 3, want to make a fool of me, fill your hands, quick." Tensely, he waited, his body coiled like a spring. A grin came back, but it didn't soften his jaw or his eyes. The men stared, their expressions a mix of anger and uncertainty. The twins looked foolish, their bravado fading. Shane, with baffled rage, wetted his lips, hesitated. Color mounted in his cheeks, and his hand inched toward his gun. Then, as if thinking better of it, he let his hand drop, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Chapter 2. A chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor, the sound cutting through the tense silence of the saloon. Rip's eyes flicked toward the noise, and he saw a man rise from his seat and stride toward him with deliberate steps. The man was middle-aged, heavily built, with a sweeping mustache that framed a rugged, square chin. His broad shoulders and confident gait spoke of a man accustomed to command. A silver star gleamed on his chest, catching the dim light of the saloon. Rip's hand twitched slightly, but he kept it relaxed, his mind racing as he wondered what the sheriff's presence might mean. The sheriff stopped a few feet away, his piercing eyes taking in the scene. Then, to Rip's surprise, the man grinned broadly, his weathered face creasing into a network of friendly lines. He stepped forward and slapped Rip's shoulder with a heavy hand, the gesture both approving and reassuring. "Glad to know a gent with sand," the sheriff said, his voice deep and hearty. Then he turned his attention to the twins and Shane, his tone shifting to one of stern reproach. "And you," he rapped out, pointing a finger at them, "looks like you threw a loop and got snarled." Shane's face darkened, but he held his tongue, his jaw working as though chewing on bitter words. "Never mind," he grated finally, his voice low and resentful. "Any bones I got to pick with this hombre'll keep." "And that goes for us," the blonde twin broke in, his voice sharp but lacking conviction. His brother nodded in silent agreement, though his eyes still burned with defiance. The sheriff chuckled, a rich, rumbling sound that filled the saloon. "Shane should have known better," he said, his tone almost paternal. "He's grown, been around. But you yearlings, gunslinging's a man's game. Best not try it till you're dry behind the ears." The twins flushed, their faces reddening with a mix of embarrassment and anger. One of them opened his mouth to retort, but the sheriff's good-natured demeanor vanished in an instant. His eyes hardened, and his voice turned cold as steel. "Button your lip," he snapped, cutting the young cowboy off before he could speak. "You're lucky he didn't blow a hole in you. Now vamoose, or I'll throw you 3 in the jug." The trio didn't need to be told twice. They shuffled out of the saloon, their boots scuffing against the floor, their heads down but their eyes still smoldering with resentment. Shane shot one last glare at Rip before disappearing through the swinging doors, his pride clearly wounded. The sheriff turned back to Rip, his expression softening once more. "If you mentioned your name, I missed it," he said, his tone friendly but curious. "Rip Wallace," Rip replied, extending his hand. The sheriff shook it firmly, his grip strong and steady. "I'll buy a drink, Rip Wallace. Folks call me Joe Cross." When the barkeep served them, Cross leaned against the bar, his eyes thoughtful as he studied Rip. "The kids ain't bad," he said, nodding toward the door where the twins and Shane had exited. "'Cept they think they're tough. Nor Shane, now and again. They're off the Circle M, the Campbell spread, 14 miles out of town. I met the Newtons, Rip said, his voice calm but his mind working. They mentioned Campbell. Cross nodded, his expression turning serious. Trouble's hatching between the two outfits. Jack Newton claims Ike Bailey's raising hob with his fences and such, and Ike Bailey claims Jack's rustling Circle M cows. Me, I don't believe Jack's a rustler, and I don't altogether believe Jack about Ike. If I did, I'd pin Ike Bailey's ears back. Rip sipped his drink, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. How big an outfit is Newton's? He asked. Can't call it an outfit, Cross replied with a shrug. Just Jack, his sister, and a half-breed kid named Manuel. The Circle M's something else. They keep 10-12 men at headquarters, and another half-dozen at line camps. Ike Bailey boss? Rip asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it from the sheriff. Sure, Cross said, his tone grim. Old Miles Campbell was out once, a year ago. Big Ike hires and fires to suit himself. They talked for a few more minutes, the conversation drifting to the state of the range and the upcoming cattle drive. Finally, Rip set his glass down and said he'd get something to eat. Sticking around? The sheriff asked, his eyes sharp with interest. Looking for a job, Rip replied simply. Then try the Circle M, Cross suggested. They'll be shipping soon. Big Ike takes on extra hands then. Rip left the saloon, his mind buzzing with thoughts of the Circle M and the trouble brewing between the two ranches. He found Jack Newton and his sister at a table in the New York cafe, their plates nearly empty. They invited him to sit, and he took a chair, ordering a meal before turning his attention to Nell, who was studying him with a curious, almost amused expression. He didn't understand her look until Jack grinned and said, 15 minutes in town, building a representative. Build a representative? Rip echoed, his brow furrowing. How come? Someone squealing? From the next table came a wheezy chuckle. Rip looked over and saw a ratty old cowboy wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The man's eyes twinkled with mischief as he cackled, Yes, sir. Slickest thing I ever seen. Shane thought he caught a suckin' dove. Got a porcupine with his quills on fire. Rip vaguely remembered the old-timer from the saloon. The talkative fool must have spread the news while Rip was with the sheriff. Rip grunted, dismissing it as idle chatter, and turned his attention to his soup. Newton leaned forward, his expression serious. You pulled a fast one on Shane Williams, but he won't forget. He's bad sober, worse drunk. Is he? Rip observed, his tone neutral. Who were the cherubs siding him? Kurt and Ed Wadding, Newton said, his voice low. Circle M outfit. If you're passing through, they don't matter. Staying. Watch Shane. Thanks, Rip said, reaching for the crackers. Pass the crackers and sauce. A shade of annoyance darkened Newton's face, but Nell laughed, her voice light and musical. If you meet them again, she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief, I hope I'm there, mister. Rip Wallace, he interrupted. Not mister. She nodded, her smile widening. All right, Rip. I hope I see the fun. Dunno about fun, Rip said, his tone dry. Next time Shane might be bolder, or drunker. The conversation shifted, and Newton suggested Rip visit the JN spread. Not much of a spread, Nell put in, her voice tinged with pride. A couple thousand acres, a few hundred head. Suits us. Visit if you like. Rip thanked them, but said a job was his priority. If I get a job here, I'll see you again. The Newtons left at sunset, and Rip, with nothing else to do, joined a poker game at the Oasis with Cross, 2 cowboys, and a store clerk. The game ran until midnight, the stakes low but the banter lively. Rip cashed in his winnings and asked about a hotel. The sheriff pointed him toward the Stockman's, a block west. Outside, the night was dark and windy, the cottonwoods swaying and creaking in the breeze. A sign above the street squeaked on its hinges, the sound eerie in the stillness. Above the rustling of the trees, Rip heard his name called. He stopped, turned, and then something hard and heavy smashed into the side of his head. The blow nearly knocked him out. Rip staggered, his vision blurring as he went down, rolling off the sidewalk into the dusty street. He tried to cover up, but the attackers were on him in an instant. Boots kicked him in the ribs and shoulder, the pain sharp and relentless. As his head cleared slightly, he grabbed at the legs of one assailant, trying to pull him down. It was a blur of fists and curses, the darkness making it impossible to see clearly. Later, he would remember crawling, grabbing at an assailant's legs, fumbling for his gun. But it was hopeless. He couldn't see, couldn't think. A fist connected with his jaw, and he tasted blood. Another blow smashed into his eyes, and his world went black. He couldn't tell how long he lay there in the dirt, the cold night air biting at his wounds. Something wet and warm sniffed at his face, a dog curious but cautious. Rip groaned, and the animal yelped, scampering off into the darkness. Slowly, painfully, Rip pushed himself to his feet. Every movement was agony, his body protesting as he staggered toward the stockman's hotel. The bald-headed clerk, dozing in a chair behind the desk, stirred as Rip stumbled in. The man's eyes widened in shock as he took in Rip's battered appearance. "Suffering Sarah," he gasped, gripping the arms of his chair. "What's the matter? Dragged by your horse?" "No," Rip managed, his voice hoarse. "Beat up. Gimme a bed and hot water." Baldy, as Rip would come to know him, was a good Samaritan. He helped Rip into a chair, then hurried to fetch warm water, a rag, and iodine. He bathed Rip's wounds with gentle hands, dabbing iodine on the worst of them. When he was done, he produced a bottle of whiskey and held it while Rip drank deeply. "Feel better now?" Baldy asked, his voice kind. Rip nodded, the whiskey warming his throat and dulling the pain. "Who climbed you?" Baldy asked, his tone curious but not prying. "3 hombres I'm calling on, sometime soon," Rip replied, his voice low and dangerous. "Know 'em?" Baldy pressed. "I know 'em," Rip said, his eyes hard. "And now, how about that bed?" With Baldy's support, Rip made it upstairs to a small, sparsely furnished room. The hotel man left the whiskey bottle on the bedside table, his expression concerned. "I'll leave this here," he said. "Best comfort for a fellow like you. I'll check on you in the morning, see if you're alive." Sheriff Cross was Rip's first visitor the next morning. The lawman swore loudly when he saw Rip's battered face. "Name 'em," he roared, his fist clenched. "Name the polecats, I'll do the rest." "Can't name anybody," Rip said, his voice weak but firm. "Too dark." "Then guess." Cross snarled, his frustration evident. "Or shall I guess for you?" Rip tried to smile, though it hurt. "Tell you, Sheriff, I'll do my own guessing and settling. You want to help. I appreciate it, but leave it to me." The sheriff needed persuading, but eventually he saw Rip's point. "But if you need help," he concluded, his tone serious, "or it's bigger than you thought, deal me in." Rip stayed close to the hotel for 3 days, his body slowly healing. His face was still bruised, but he could move without pain. On the 4th morning, he paid his bill, thanked Baldy, and got his horse. With the morning sun at his back and cold vengeance in his heart, he headed for the Circle M. It was 14 miles to the ranch, and Rip traveled slowly, his body still tender. It was nearly noon when he reached the Circle M gate and saw the ranch house, barns, and corrals spread out before him. As he rode past the blacksmith shop, a tall, wide-shouldered man with a clipped mustache and clean-shaven chin stepped out. The man glanced at Rip, frowned, and nodded. "How are you?" Rip nodded back. "Yeah, howdy." "Then, know anyone around here?" "Should," allowed the man, his voice cool. "I hire 'em." "Then maybe you know a fellow named Shane Williams." Ike Bailey jerked his head, signaling Rip to follow, and led the way to the bunkhouse. "Shane," he yelled, his voice carrying across the yard. "Someone to see you." Rip sat on his strawberry roan and waited, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his .45. The horse wanted to nuzzle the grass by the bunkhouse door, but Rip held its head up, his eyes sharp and alert. He might need quick action. He heard boot heels, and then Shane Williams's face appeared in the doorway and stared into the muzzle of Rip's .45. Chapter 3. Rip grinned. "Hi, Shane. Step out and get him up." Shane shot an appealing look at Bailey, saw no help there, and sidled through the door, hands up. "Where's the others?" Rip rapped. "The Burke boys?" Shane stared malevolently. "Never heard of 'em." Still covering Williams, Rip swung off the roan, walked up to Shane, said, "Ain't got a gun on you, yay?" "Well," Rip slipped his own gun into its holster, unbuckled the belt, and let gun and belt fall. "Neither have I." Rip went to work on him. His fists caught him off guard and smashed him full in the face. He hooked, slugged, and jabbed, rocking the bow-legged puncher dizzy. He finally floored him with an uppercut that exploded like dynamite. With Shane rolling and groaning, the lone spectator turned to Rip. "Me," he remarked. "I'm only the foreman of this spread, and as such don't cut much of a swath. But if you'd care to tell me what it's all about, I'd listen." Rip massaged his knuckles, gave a ghost of a smile. "I called this gent," indicating Shane, "and the Burke boys for a showdown in town the other night. They hadn't the guts to call me back. But in the dark, they evened the score. The old face shows part of the job they did. And if you want me to shuck my shirt, I'll show you the rest." The foreman nodded slowly. "Uh-huh." He surveyed Shane, now sitting up and feeling his jaw. "You ain't done bad for a start, and if you want to make medicine with Kurt and Ed, you can catch 'em at noon." He squinted at the sun. "Yeah, by the time you've put your horse away, things should be ready." Rip stabled his horse, fed him, and returned to the bunkhouse. There was no sign of Shane. Big Ike Bailey was sitting in the shade, rolling a smoke. He nodded. "Come sit down." He offered the makings. "Build one?" They smoked in silence. With the cigarette half finished, Rip heard thudding hoofs. Bailey nodded, and Rip stood up to see 3 men ride in. "Twins!" yelled Bailey, and 2 of the horses swung. And once more Rip looked on the pair that had faced him that night in the oasis. "Friend of yourn, maybe?" Rip had buckled on his gun again. With a thumb hooked in the belt, he walked the half-dozen paces till he stood between the 2. He looked from one to the other and saw the fear in their eyes. "Remember me?" he asked. The blonde was on his left, the black-haired one on his right. Casually, Rip said. "You remember me all right," Rip went on. So did Shane. "When Shane gets around, talk things over with him. You'll find him interesting." If the twins were puzzled, so was the red-haired puncher, and so was Big Ike Bailey. But they weren't left in suspense long. For as Rip had been speaking and stroking the horse, his hand had traveled. Now he made a swoop and seized the gun from one twin's holster. His right hand balled into a fist, smashed the other twin from his horse. The riderless horse reared, snorted. As the black-haired twin got to his feet, Rip floored him with a vicious maker. The other twin swung his horse and tried to ride Rip down. Rip grabbed the headstall, and now, thoroughly roused, he seized the blonde by the belt and upset him. What followed was a repetition of what happened to Shane, save that the twins showed far less fight. In half a minute, Rip had reaped full satisfaction. Then, breathing heavily, he nodded to Ike Bailey. "Guess that squares things," he said. "And thanks for the cooperation." "Don't mention it," Bailey said. "Always willing to oblige." Then, as Rip turned toward the barn, he halted him. "But what's the rush? Cook says dinner's ready. Come and get it before he throws it in the creek." Neither Shane nor the twins appeared at the meal, but 7 other men did. They nodded to Rip and ate. At the meal's end, Ike Bailey spoke. "Workin'?" Bailey asked. "Nope." "Want to work?" "Sure." "You're hired. The Circle M pays 40 and grub." A smile spread over Rip's battered face. Just like that. Don't need references, where I done time last or whose doggies I rustled? Bailey shrugged. None of my affair, up till now. But with shipping starting in a couple weeks, the Circle M can use a gent who knows his way around. He jerked his head toward the bunkhouse. See, you got your war bag. Help yourself to an empty stall. You can start work in the morning. Never mind the morning, said Rip. When I'm hired, I work. Bailey, never surprised, shrugged. Okay. Come on. He led the way to a small warehouse, dug up a sack of staples, an axe, and a hammer. Grab 'em, he ordered, and let's see what sort of a fencer you are. He pointed through the doorway to a 3-wire fence that began at the barns and ran south out of sight. That's our west line, he stated. Anything west belongs to the JN outfit. The JN and us don't get along. Maybe Newton can explain why the fence is always down and we're shy of cattle. I can't. But there's your job. She runs 7 miles south. Rip got his roan from the barn, saddled, and began his new job. He rode slowly for an hour before finding damage to the fence. Then he came to a place where the top strand had snapped and the second was sagging. He had baling wire and went to work. As he worked, he glanced around. Here, on Circle M land, was a flat stretch of sand and sage that ended at a rampart of rock. Even for Wyoming, the country looked dry, and off to the east was a lone windmill that proved Jack Newton's reference to the Circle M's method of procuring water. To the west, on JN land, things were different. Close by, the sand was parched, but a little further on was a gently sloping valley, green with grass and threaded by a ribbon of cottonwoods. Cottonwood Creek, the creek Jack Newton had spoken of, the water supply that was the bone of contention between the Circle M and Jack Newton's spread. Working, Rip glanced up to see a rider moving along the creek. Rip paid little attention, as he seemed to be riding in the opposite direction. But when 5 minutes later his horse whinnied, he looked up again. The rider was not more than 50 yards away, and Rip noticed with pleasure that the rider was Nell Newton. Rip straightened, pushed his hat back. "Mornin', Miss Newton," he smiled. "Who'd think of meeting you way out here?" But there was no smile on Nell's face. She frowned at his battered countenance. "So," she observed, "you did get a job." Rip seemed puzzled. "Sure, I got a job. Didn't I say I was looking for one? And I hope it suits you. Ike Bailey can always use a man of your talents." The contempt in her voice and look almost floored Rip. "My talents?" he echoed. "Yes, of course. You're handy with a gun, aren't you?" Something hot began to burn around Rip's neck. This cool-eyed girl with the stubborn chin was trying to misbrand him. He grinned lazily. "I guess you call the turn. Remember saying you'd like to be on hand the next time I ran into Shane and the Burke boys? You weren't there, but it happened. And those talents came in handy. Ike saw the sample, and we closed a deal." Nell flushed. Her eyes were hot and furious. "He would," she said. "I know Ike Bailey. And I think," she added with brittle scorn, "I'm beginning to understand you." Shane and the Burkes were at headquarters when Rip arrived that evening. They said nothing, but Shane looked his hate. The other men seemed more friendly, and Rip decided his run-in with Shane and his companions had been spread around. Next day, Ike sent Rip to a line camp 8 miles southwest. He was told a man was there, Spotty Foster. Spotty was gathering strays and would return to headquarters in a couple of days. "So go help him," Ike said. Shane was standing nearby. Big Ike noticed this. "Yeah," Big Ike went on. "I got to keep you two sidewinders separated for a spell. So you, Shane, and the twins get busy and fix up that pasture fence." Rip rode away. Not far from headquarters, he noticed 30 or 40 head of prime beef stock grazing together. They were steers, sleek and fat. With shipping time coming, these would pay big dividends. He rode on, and 3 miles away pulled up. All the tobacco he owned was the quarter-full sack of Durham in his shirt pocket. This was bad. Rip, when he had to, could go without food and sleep. But he couldn't get along without a smoke. Not for 2 days with Spotty Foster. On the other hand, Big Ike or the cook would probably keep a supply at headquarters. The only thing to do was to turn back. He reached the ranch buildings, rode around a barn, and found Shane and the Burkes saddling their horses in the corral. Big Ike was there too. "What's this?" he demanded. "Thought I told you to hit for the line camp." Rip nodded. "Keep your shirt on," he told Big Ike coolly. "I'm going, as soon as I get some tobacco. Don't figure on being without a smoke for 2 full days." Big Ike subsided. "Pity you wouldn't think of that before." "Got any?" "No." "See the cook. Tell him to charge it up to you." Rip got the tobacco. When he rode past the corral again, only the foreman and the 3 saddled horses were in sight. "Get it?" the ramrod called. Rip nodded. "Well," Bailey said, "fog along. Spotty should have had help long ago." Rip rode away, wondering. The loss of an hour shouldn't have put the man off balance. Rip tried to figure out what had gotten into Bailey's hair. "What's the matter with him?" snarled Spotty Foster, an old wizened cowhand, when Wallace told him a few things later in the day. "And who said I wanted help? I got darn near all the strays together." Rip smiled. With Jack Newton doing all the rustling, maybe Ike's getting worried about all these loners out here. Jack Newton rustling. Old Spotty jabbed at the steaks he was frying. "I've heard that tune till it's worn me out. Jack ain't rustling no 100 head a month. But Ike says the stock is going someplace." "Sure, it's going someplace. But Jack ain't getting it." "Then who is?" "How should I know? And I never made it my job to find out." With the strays already bunched, there was little to do but hold them together, and Rip turned his mind to thinking. From Spotty Foster, he found the Circle M's neighbors were supposedly honest. If rustlers were operating, they were a gang who struck quickly and made their getaway unseen. He found also that the losses were generally 30 or 40 head at a time. 30 or 40 head made him think of the bunch of fat stock he had seen near headquarters that morning. Hooked up with this came the thought that, instead of fixing the pasture fence, Shane and the twins were saddled up and going places. And lastly, Big Ike had seemed disturbed when Rip Wallace appeared. "Ike was telling me," Wallace said to Foster as they rode along, "that they'd be shipping before long." "Where does he ship from?" "Cactus Siding." "And where's Cactus Siding?" "Due east of here, about 17 miles. Old Spotty became informative. "There's a new railroad going through to Casper, and loading chutes have been built at the siding. The chutes and corrals are all the siding amounts to." "You mean nobody's living there?" "Not a soul, only the roadrunners and prairie dogs." After a pause, Rip said he'd like to see a bit of the country roundabout. Old Spotty gave a quiet chuckle. "Want to see the country, eh? Well, help yourself to lots of it. And if Cactus Siding interests you in particular, it lays right over there. If I was the more ambitious kind, I'd go along with you." Chapter 4. "And next thing," said Rip, "I'd be guessing things about me." He paused. "I saw a bunch of cattle." At a rise, he glimpsed 3 men on horses. He heard the bawling of cattle and the snorting of horses. "Cactus Siding," he concluded. 100 yards away." He crept closer. He saw 2 cattle cars. He nodded. "Aha," Wallace said to himself. He examined his hand. "Knife went in," he said. He reached the line camp at dusk. Foster sprawled on a bunk. "Back, eh? Locate the siding." "Yeah." "Run into it? Any trouble?" Rip said nope. A splinter was deeply embedded in his hand. Old Spotty helped remove it. "How'd you get that?" he asked. "Fell into it," Rip told him. "That's likely where the knife went, and some loose change I had in my pocket." Rip sat at the table to eat and listened to Spotty fish for news. "You made good time," Foster observed. "Had to," Rip said. Nothing like 3 gunslinging hombres on a fellow's tail to help him fog along. 3 of 'em, yay? Spotty debated, then chuckled. "Yeah. 3 would be about right. And seems like you and me had the same hunch about things." Pushing the rounded-up strays, they reached headquarters about noon next day. They found Bailey alone. "Didn't expect you back till tomorrow," the ramrod observed. "Today's Saturday payday," Foster reminded him. "Or ain't a fellow supposed to go to town after a hard week's work?" Big Ike nodded. "Guess I forgot about that." The twins and Shane showed up at dinner time. Across the table, Shane gave Rip a keen, low-lidded glance. He said nothing, and Rip gave no sign he noticed. After chow, Bailey paid off and ordered 2 men, Buck Connors and Slim Fields, to stay. The rest, he said, were free to hit Buffalo City. Rip and Foster struck out for town 10 minutes later. Free of Spotty, Rip walked to the Buffalo City Railway Depot, grabbed telegraph blanks, wrote messages, and handed them to the agent. One was to a Laramie bank, the other to the Casper Railway traffic manager. "Send these at once," Wallace told the operator. "Hold replies till I pick them up." The agent read the messages, frowned, said, "Sure, I'll do that." Rip looked at the man, finally said, "How do you play 'em? Pretty close to your chest." "If we didn't," the agent replied slowly, "we wouldn't hold the job very long." Rip nodded, walked out, crossed to the Oasis and sat on the porch. He saw Jack Newton coming down the street. Newton rode to the hitch rail, nodded to Rip, and dismounted. As he came up the steps, Rip spoke. "Me," he said, "I'm funny. If I've got a grudge, I come out with it. How about you?" Newton shrugged. "Dunno how I am. But if it's regarding who a fellow works for, that's his own affair." "Figured it was," Rip admitted. Newton seemed to relax. "Nell told me she peeled you down the other day. I told her it was none of our affair, that if we couldn't hire a man, we couldn't kick about him working for someone else." "Sure," said Rip. "And you can tell her that if she catches me busting your fence or chasing your stock, she's welcome to plug me on sight." Nell's brother grinned. "I told her so already. Even mentioned you were different than Big Ike and his gang." "And what did she say?" "Want to know?" Newton hesitated. "She said if you played with the curs, you'd catch their fleas." Rip deliberated, then grinned. "She did, eh? That's rough, but as long as she didn't say I was one of the curs, seems like I still got a chance." Rip was buying a jackknife at the general store when Big Ike walked in. The foreman nodded, and the storekeeper, a hook-nosed man, was poring over accounts. Wallace looked after the ramrod, shrugged, and left with his knife. His mind was working as he crossed the dusty street. The Oasis was filled. Rip, Bailey, and 3 other punchers were playing poker when Jack Newton came in. His face was grim. He walked to Big Ike. "Bailey," Newton said savagely, "where can we go?" Ike said, "And anything you got to say, you can say here." Newton's eyes narrowed. "Okay. I've just seen Ben Bernstein." Big Ike seemed interested. "So? What's he got to say?" "You'd know." "What's he got to say?" "He showed me that note of yours." "Oh yeah? That note for $1,000. Sure, I took it over." Jack Newton seemed to lose control. 6 months ago, he told me he'd renew it for another year. Now you own it. What do you say?" Bailey sneered. "I ain't saying anything like that. All I'm saying is that the note is due in a week's time, and I ain't fooling with you no more than I ever did." Expecting something like that, the JN boss rasped. "In other words, I've got to sell every cow I own to square you, or you'll walk in. It's tough, Big Ike admitted. But you've summed up things plumb neatly. Rip expected action as he cleared his spurs from the chair legs. But Newton had another question. Where's that note? He asked. Where is it? Echoed Big Ike. Right here, in my pocket. And she can go to yours as soon as you settle. As Jack Newton's hand inched toward his gun, Rip Wallace saw Shane Williams materialize behind Newton, his fingers on his six-shooter. Jack didn't have a chance. If he drew on Ike, Shane would get him. It was arranged. Wallace looked across at Shane, nodded bleakly, said, All right, Williams. Cut me in on the deal. His voice shattered the tension. Shane blinked, let his hand drop as Jack Newton looked around. Rip smiled at Big Ike Bailey. Sorry if I broke things up, but our friend was getting spooky. And if he can't handle a .45 better than his dukes, we were all in danger. Big Ike glared, then took a cue from Rip's words. Shane. He looked around. What's the matter with Shane? Shane said, Nothing's the matter with me. He's the one getting spooky. I don't know what he's talking about. Rip glanced at Newton, shrugged. Maybe I was mistaken. Yeah, maybe I was. But what's the fuss? Let's get on with the game. The game continued until Newton left. Then Rip suggested they cash in. He said to Big Ike, Guess I'll head home. Coming or staying? He wanted to be with Big Ike until he was sure Jack Newton was gone. Big Ike shook his head. Not for a while. Got a couple other fellers to see first. The night was clear, the moon sinking when Wallace left the oasis. Instead of the Circle M, he went to the depot. Wallace read the telegrams, then said, Crazy old world, ain't it? The agent agreed. Lot of crazy people. Rip went to Sheriff Cross's office. Cross, McNeil said, was out of town, but expected back soon. Rip ate at the cafe. When he went back, Cross was there. Wallace told Cross of the Newton Bailey run-in over the note. Ike's intended foreclosure had a connection with the telegrams. Rip told Cross other things too. Cross nodded grimly. There's more than a chance that Ike figures you're the man that saw the loading over at Cactus. If we're going to make medicine with him at all, we'd better do it right now. We must get him pinned up, Rip agreed. He might pay a constable at Circle M expense. He might pay him to vamoose with what he's got, rather than chance it any longer. When Cross and Rip left the oasis, the bartender said Ike had left only a little while before. Said he was going home, the man informed them. Rip, out of earshot, looked at the sheriff. Cross shrugged, said, Sure, we'll take after him. He's slippery, and we don't know what's in his mind. Rip got his horse from the livery and met the sheriff a few minutes later. A mile and a half from town, their ponies skidded to a stop, snorting and wheeling, trying to bolt. The sheriff cursed his hammer-headed gelding. What's the matter with you, anyway? He growled. Scared of a jackrabbit? Rip stared ahead. That's no jackrabbit, he blurted. It's a... They swung down, led their blowing horses closer to the figure sprawled across the road, arms outspread. Hold him till I take a look, Cross ordered, and went forward and rolled the man onto his back. By the light of a match, Rip recognized him. It was Big Ike Bailey. Chapter 5. Bailey was dead as a ham. A bullet had caught him clean through the heart. The sheriff stood up. Then dead. What'll we do now? Take him to town, I suppose, Rip said. They reached the lockup from the rear, carried Big Ike inside, and laid him on the floor. Guess I'd better search him, the sheriff said. The search produced tobacco, papers, a bulging wallet, loose coins, and Rip Wallace's knife. The handle was chipped with 2 filed crosses. But how had it gotten there? Who had used it on Bailey? Cross broke Rip's thoughts. You said Ike had that note on him. It ain't here. Rip frowned. You sure? Turned all his pockets out, didn't I? The two men looked at each other. Cross broke the silence. Jack Newton ain't around town. I'm riding out to his place. Want to come along? Rip smiled thinly. Got your mind made up already? The sheriff evaded the question. Coming. Jack Newton was not in town, but searching for him, they came across Deputy Jerry McNeil. The sheriff informed him of the murder, told him to stay in the office. It was 12 miles to Jack Newton's spread, and he seemed asleep. The sheriff pounded on the door, and Newton came down. He was barefoot, dressed in pants and shirt, and carried a lamp. Here, Jack, said the sheriff solemnly. Can we come in? Inside, Cross wasted no time. We found Big Ike a bit this side of town. He was dead, drilled through the heart. Jack Newton stared. After a moment he said, Big Ike killed. Then, who killed him? Of course, Jack, Cross said slowly, you wouldn't know. Newton seemed puzzled, but when the inference hit him, his eyes went hard. How should I know? He flared. Ike had a note of yours on him tonight, Joe Cross said. I wish I knew where it went. Wasn't it on him? Newton demanded. You mean someone took it? I guess I do. There was a second of silence, then Newton blew up. What the hell's all this anyhow? He barked. Are you hinting I killed that hombre to get my note back? If you are, you're crazy. From above Rip's head came the squeak of a board, and Nell Newton appeared, a blanket wrapped around her nightclothes. Rip saw she was shivering. Her face, framed by plaited hair, was pale. I heard what you said, Sheriff, she said. But you can't think Jack had any hand in this murder. Joe Cross looked uncomfortable, but stubborn. I can only think what my eyes and ears tell me. I'll work on the murder, and Jack will get all the breaks coming to him, but in the meantime I'll have to hold him. You're going to arrest me? A lump went up and down in Jack Newton's throat. Then his jaw hardened and he wheeled on his sister. Get out of here, Nell, he ordered. I'll handle this myself. Don't be an idiot, Nell cried. Fighting won't get you anywhere. It'll only brand you as guilty. Guilty? Snarled Jack. I might as well be guilty, for all the show I'll get. The setup's against me. I hated Ike. I argued with him, and then this note of mine that he took over has disappeared. What did a jury say? But it ain't got to the jury yet, Sheriff Cross pointed out. We'll do all we can to see it don't get that far. Who's we? Newton demanded. You and him. With a sneer, he jerked his head toward Rip Wallace. Him, a Circle M man? A Circle M man, Cross agreed. But at the same time, a man who saved your skin once already tonight. That is, if what I heard about your quarrel with Big Ike in the Oasis was true. And when Jack Newton's eyes wavered, he added, So you'd better get your stuff together, Jack, and ride into town with us. But it was the girl who made the decision. We'll be with you, Sheriff, just as soon as we can get dressed. The first streak of dawn was lighting the east when they reached Buffalo City. The Oasis was still open, and as they approached, a dozen men came boiling out. Rip heard the voice of Shane Williams. There they are. Grab the pair of 'em. The crowd surged onto the street. Men tried to pull Rip down. Newton cursed. The girl cried out. But Joe Cross roared, What's coming off here? He drew his gun, smashed a man's head, and pulled Nell with him. Ride? He yelled at Rip and Newton. Run for the jail. Rip lifted the roan. The horse reared, kicked. Rip rode alongside Newton, shot at the mob. Inside the jail, Cross yelled at Jerry McNeil to bar the door. Killing mob, he roared. But I'll give 'em trouble. Boots, shouts, and curses echoed on the porch. Hard-faced, Rip drew his gun, looked at Nell. Back in there, he ordered. Bullets are flying. The mob yelled and pounded. Shane Williams's voice rose, Burn 'em out. The yelling grew louder. Rip and the sheriff stood side by side, guns in hand. Ready? Rip asked. Before Cross replied, something crashed the door in. A battering ram. Knowing death stared them down, the sheriff yelled to Jack and his sister to escape by the rear. Then he and Rip fired. They fired once, but it wasn't enough. Men screamed, fell, and were trampled. Rip almost shot again, but firing into a mob was murder. While he hesitated, the mob gained ground. It swept in, carrying Rip and the sheriff. They fought, swinging their guns. Rip's idea, shared by the sheriff, was to hold the mob until Jack and his sister escaped. The table went over, the lamp exploded. Hell broke loose. Blazing oil coursed along the floor, caught on a newspaper, leapt up, and seized documents. Rip clawed at the papers, broke the window, and threw them out. Doing so, he wrought greater destruction. Someone had sprayed kerosene on the walls. The lockup was a blazing inferno. Suddenly sobered, those inside fought to get out. They jammed the doors, cursed, and smashed at each other. Rip saw the window. The frame was blazing, but it offered a way out. He nudged the sheriff, turning when he saw Shane. Shane was one of the first in. Now he was frantic to escape. Rip grabbed him. Out the window, he yelled. Cross read Rip's intent. Let me out first. I'll nab him when he comes. The sheriff smashed the frame with a chair. Hat over his eyes, he drove through. Shane went next. Rip followed. Rip miscalculated Shane's speed. Shane crashed into the sheriff. By the time Rip got through, Shane was 50 yards away. At first, he had the light of the blazing lockup, but when Shane turned into the street and they got away from the fire, Rip saw the gray of morning. He saw Shane racing for 3 saddled horses beside the oasis. Rip threw a couple of shots and cursed himself. Running, he was merely emptying his gun. But the shots had some effect on Shane. Instead of grabbing a horse, he dove. Rip rammed 2 shells into the cylinder of his .45 and followed. He gained on the fleeing puncher. He smashed open the doors as Shane reached the bar. Shane heard him, wheeled, fired. A bullet zipped through Rip's shirt, burning his ribs. Rip shot once and Shane went down. At first, Rip thought he'd killed him. Gun in hand, he moved forward. But Shane wasn't dead. He'd been half-turned. Rip's bullet hit his belt buckle, glanced off, and buried itself in the bar. It had winded Shane, who now crawled up, holding his belly. Looks like I missed, said Rip. And that's too bad. Now you're going to talk. There was a commotion as Sheriff Cross and a dozen men barged in. The fire and their escape had sobered them. Some came because they'd seen the pursuit. Shane's breath returned. He tried to get up, his face showing surprise. Yeah, drawled Rip. I'm mad I didn't kill you. Like I said, you're going to talk. Shane gave a start. He sneered, me? Kill Ike? Why would I? You're crazy or drunk. You thought you were killing me, Rip said. Shane tried to turn, but the sheriff stopped him. Hold it, Rip. If you're gunning this polecat on my account, you shouldn't. Rip spoke over his shoulder. Figured you'd be okay. But this is something else. He turned back to Shane. Like I said, you thought you were killing me. And you had reason. Want to know the reason? You, Big Ike, and others have shipped over 500 head of Circle M cows. I saw you. It was a neat job. Not only were you and Ike in it, but the train crew too. A couple of telegrams told me a lot. And the day after I got away from you, at the loading chutes, you rode back to pick up sign. Rip grinned. What you did pick up was my jackknife. Shane blinked, his jaw muscles bulged. But he forced a sneer. If this is supposed to interest me. Keep listening, advised Rip. You'll be plenty interested. And I was talking about that jackknife. You handed it to Big Ike. He couldn't identify it, but he suspected me. I know that much. I blundered onto you, and the Burke boys saddling up when you were supposed to be fixing fences. Big Ike figured I was spying. And if he wanted proof, he got it when he found me buying a jackknife to replace the one I lost. I should have worried about that missing jackknife. But I didn't. It could have put me in a bad spot. Maybe it did. But no tougher a spot than Big Ike found himself in when he knew I was onto his game. So last night, when I said I was riding home, he hunted you up. He told you to get up the road and bushwhack me. But too bad for Ike, I didn't go so soon. He went ahead of me, the light was poor, and you finished your job. Shane's eyes narrowed. His lips drew in, his jaws bulged. Slick, he snarled. Slicker than frog's hair, this yarn you're telling. But how you gonna prove it? Rip staked all on a bluff. He thought he knew Shane, knew him to be long-headed and cool. Shane, finding he'd killed the wrong man, wouldn't panic. Knowing the killing of Big Ike would cause a stir, something had to be done. Another suspect was needed. And who better than Jack Newton? Rip told Shane all this. So you know what you did. You took Jack's note out of Big Ike's pocket to make things appear bad for Jack. And the note is in your pocket right now. The bluff worked. Shane's face showed the desperate look of a cornered wolf. He was unarmed, his gun lay at his feet, and his former allies looked at him with disgust. Then his eyes dropped. He swayed. With a groan, he collapsed. A man laughed. Fainted. Some guts. Sheriff Cross moved to do his job. Rip Wallace holstered his gun. No one expected trickery. But as the sheriff stooped, Shane's fingers closed over the .45. He grabbed it, sprang up and fired, not at the sheriff, but at Rip. The slug hit Rip's shoulder. 3 inches lower, and it would have killed him. The force spun him around, and the second bullet missed. But Rip's hand streaked to his holster. It was a lightning move, a swoop down, a zipping upward arc, a blast of fire. This time, when Shane went down, all the guns in the world couldn't help him. There was no doctor in Buffalo City, but Sheriff Joe Cross had treated many bullet wounds. So now, with rye for a bracer, Rip Wallace submitted to a probing and digging that brought a mushroomed .45 bullet to light. The operation was performed in the New York Cafe, aided by Nell Newton and Deputy Jerry McNeil. Jack Newton was present, but as a spectator. Rip was thankful for the rye. He needed it. And as an Antonelli to the pain, he tried to explain. Spotty Foster out at the line camp helped me a lot. Big Ike and Shane never knew it, but Spotty was a real Miles Campbell man. Old Miles got suspicious when the cattle returns didn't show what they ought, so he had Spotty hire out with Big Ike and keep his eyes and ears open. Spotty didn't know me, but he put 2 and 2 together pretty well. Nell Newton was holding Rip's arm while the sheriff started bandaging. Now and again, a strand of her hair tickled Rip's nose, and the touch sent little pulsations through him. You know, Miss Newton, he said, you blamed Miles Campbell for a lot of things you shouldn't have done. Miles Campbell never had anything against you. He never tried to run you off or ruin you. All that can be charged up to Big Ike Bailey's account. He wanted your spread, and why not? He had cleaned up several thousand by rustling Circle M stock, and your place would have suited him fine. Now the girl's curiosity got the better of her. How do you know so much about Miles Campbell? And just who are you? A range detective for the Cattlemen's Association? Who, me? Rip laughed, partly from the probing, partly from joy. I'm no detective of any kind. I'm old Miles Campbell's son. Shocked, Nell let his arm fall. He winced, and at once she was sympathetic. I'm sorry, but you said your name was Wallace. So it is, Rip Wallace Campbell, if you want it all. He managed to grin at her. And as I told you, Arizona is my stamping ground. Down there, I run another spread for the old man. But he sent me up here on this special duty. The girl looked at her brother, then at the grinning sheriff. "And when I uttered those mean things about your father, you never said a word," she said. "Remember the time I was fixing the fence?" Rip asked her. "Well, what did you say about me?" She blushed. Rip's heart began to pound. He didn't know this girl very well, but he wanted to. And there was just one way to know her. "You asked me one time to come out and visit you. I said I'd like to, but a job came first. I found the job, and it's finished. But the invitation, does it still hold good?" Out the window, a light shot up. It was a final surge of the flames that had been a funeral pyre for Big Ike Bailey. The girl missed this. She was looking down at Rip, blushing more rosily than ever. "After what you did for Jack. And for me. Come out," she said, "at any time. And stay as long as you like." Chapter 6. The dawn broke over Buffalo City like a hesitant sigh, its pale light creeping over the charred remains of the jailhouse. The air still carried the acrid stench of burnt wood and kerosene, mingling with the faint tang of dew on the prairie grass. Sheriff Joe Cross stood in the middle of the street, his hat pulled low over his eyes, surveying the damage. His face was grim, the lines around his mouth deeper than usual. Beside him, Rip Campbell, leaned against a hitching post, his shoulder bandaged and his expression thoughtful. "Well," Cross said finally, his voice rough as gravel, "this town's seen better days." Rip nodded, his gaze drifting to the smoldering ruins. "Reckon it has. But it'll see better ones, too. We'll make sure of that." The sheriff shot him a sidelong glance, his eyes narrowing. "You've got a mighty big job ahead of you, son. Taking over the Circle M ain't gonna be no Sunday picnic. Them hands of Bailey's, they're a rough bunch. And now that they know who you really are." Rip's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained hard. "They'll fall in line. Or they'll ride out. Either way, the Circle M's gonna be run right from here on out." Cross grunted, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned his attention to the small crowd that had gathered in the street. Townsfolk and cowhands alike stood in clusters, their faces etched with worry and curiosity. The news of Big Ike Bailey's death and Rip's true identity had spread like wildfire, and now everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Among the crowd, Rip spotted Nell Newton. She stood apart from the others, her gray eyes fixed on him, her expression unreadable. Her brother Jack was beside her, his arms crossed and his jaw set in a hard line. Rip met Nell's gaze and gave her a small nod, which she returned after a moment's hesitation. Then she turned and said something to Jack, who nodded reluctantly before the two of them started toward Rip and the sheriff. "Morning," Jack said as they approached, his tone cautious. He glanced at Rip's bandaged shoulder. "How's the arm?" "Stiff," Rip admitted, "but it'll heal." "Thanks for asking." Jack nodded, his eyes flicking to the sheriff. "What's the plan now? With Bailey gone, things are gonna get messy. You know that, right?" Cross sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I know. But we'll handle it. First order of business is to make sure the Circle M don't fall apart. That's where Rip comes in." Jack's gaze shifted back to Rip, his expression wary. "You sure you're up for this? Running a spread like the Circle M ain't exactly a one-man job." "I'll manage," Rip said, his voice steady. "And I'll have help. Spotty Foster, for one. He's been keeping an eye on things for my father for a while now. He'll know who we can trust and who needs to go." Nell stepped forward then, her voice soft but firm. "And what about us? Jack and I, we've got our own spread to worry about. But if there's anything we can do to help." Rip's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I appreciate that, Nell. Right now, the best thing you can do is keep your head down and stay out of trouble. Bailey's gone, but there are still plenty of folks out there who'd like to see both our ranches fail." Jack snorted, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Yeah, and some of them are probably standing right here in this town. You think Shane was working alone? Not a chance. There's more to this rustling operation than we know. Maybe, Rip conceded. But we'll figure it out. One step at a time. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the edge of town. All four turned to see a rider coming in at a gallop, his horse lathered and his face flushed with urgency. As he drew closer, Rip recognized him as one of the Circle M hands, a young cowboy named Slim Fields. "Rip?" Slim called as he reined in his horse, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You gotta come quick. There's trouble at the ranch." Rip's stomach tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "What kind of trouble?" Slim shook his head, his eyes wide with panic. "It's the Burke twins. They've rounded up a bunch of the boys and are talking about riding out. They're saying they won't work for no Campbell, not after what happened to Bailey." Rip exchanged a glance with Cross and Jack, his jaw tightening. "Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us." Nell stepped forward, her voice firm. "I'm coming with you." Rip shook his head. "No, Nell. This ain't your fight. Stay here with Jack." But Nell's eyes flashed with determination. "It is my fight. This town, these ranches, they're my home. I'm not gonna sit back and let a bunch of hotheads tear everything apart." Rip hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "All right. But you stay close to me, understand?" Nell nodded, her expression resolute. "I will." The four of them mounted up and rode out of town, the rising sun casting long shadows across the prairie. As they approached the Circle M, they could see a group of men gathered near the corral, their voices raised in angry argument. The Burke twins stood at the center of the group, their faces flushed and their hands resting on their gun belts. Rip reined in his horse a few yards away and dismounted, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He walked toward the group, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his Colt. The men fell silent as he approached, their eyes flicking nervously between him and the Burke twins. "Morning, boys," Rip said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Heard there was some trouble. Thought I'd come see what it's all about." Kurt Burke, the darker of the twins, stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "We ain't working for you, Campbell. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? Not a chance." Rip's gaze didn't waver. "You're right. I can't make you work for me. But I can sure as hell make you leave. Now, if you've got a problem with that, let's hear it." For a moment, no one moved. Then Kurt's hand twitched toward his gun, but before he could draw, Rip's Colt was in his hand, the barrel leveled at Kurt's chest. "Don't," Rip said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'd hate to have to shoot you in front of your brother." The tension in the air was palpable, but slowly Kurt lowered his hand. "You'll regret this, Campbell," he spat. "You mark my words." Rip holstered his gun, his expression calm. "Maybe. But for now, you've got two choices. You can ride out peacefully, or I can throw you out. What's it gonna be?" The twins exchanged a glance, then turned and stalked toward their horses, their faces dark with anger. The other men watched in silence as they mounted up and rode out, their dust trail fading into the distance. Rip turned to the remaining hands, his voice firm. "Anyone else got a problem with me running this ranch?" No one spoke. After a moment, one of the older cowhands stepped forward, his hat in his hands. "We're with you, Rip. Just tell us what you need." Rip nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good. Let's get to work." As the men dispersed, Nell stepped up beside Rip, her eyes shining with admiration. "You handled that well." Rip glanced at her, his expression softening. "I had to. This ranch, this town, it's worth fighting for." Nell smiled, her hand brushing against his. "Yeah, it is." Chapter 7. The sun hung high over the Circle M ranch, casting a golden glow across the rolling hills and the sprawling corrals. The air was alive with the sounds of cattle lowing, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and the occasional shout of a cowboy herding strays. Rip Campbell stood on the porch of the ranch house, his hat tipped back as he surveyed the scene. His shoulder still ached from the bullet wound, but the pain was a distant throb compared to the satisfaction he felt seeing the ranch come back to life. Spotty Foster, the grizzled old hand who had been Miles Campbell's eyes and ears on the Circle M, leaned against the porch railing beside him. "You've done good, Rip," Spotty said, his voice raspy but warm. "Real good. Them boys are starting to respect you. Even the ones who were loyal to Bailey." Rip nodded, his gaze following a group of cowhands as they worked to repair a section of fence. "Respect's a start," he said. "But we've got a long way to go. Bailey left this place in a mess, and it's going to take more than a few days to clean it up." Spotty chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You sound just like your pa. Always looking ahead, never satisfied with just getting by." Rip smiled faintly. "Guess I take after him more than I thought." The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention, and Rip turned to see Jack Newton riding into the yard. Jack dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements brisk but deliberate. He climbed the porch steps and nodded to Rip and Spotty. "Morning. Thought I'd ride over and see how things were shaping up." "Morning, Jack," Rip said, extending a hand. "Things are coming along. Slowly but surely." Jack shook his hand, his grip firm. "Good to hear. Nell sends her regards. She wanted to come herself, but she's busy with the books. Says she's got a stack of ledgers taller than she is." Rip chuckled. "Sounds like Nell. She's not one to sit still for long." Jack's expression grew serious as he glanced around the yard. "You've got your hands full here, Rip. I won't lie, I was skeptical when you first took over. But you've proven me wrong. This place is starting to look like a real ranch again." "Thanks," Rip said, his tone genuine. "That means a lot coming from you." Jack hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Listen, Rip. I know we've had our differences, but I want you to know I'm with you. Whatever you need, you've got my support. And Nell's too." Rip met Jack's gaze, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I appreciate that, Jack. More than you know." The three men stood in companionable silence for a moment, the camaraderie between them growing stronger with each passing day. But the peace was short-lived. A shout from the corral drew their attention, and Rip turned to see one of the younger cowhands, a wiry kid named Tommy, running toward them, his face pale. "Rip," Tommy called, skidding to a stop at the base of the porch. "You gotta come quick. There's trouble at the north pasture." Rip's stomach tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "What kind of trouble?" Tommy shook his head, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's the Burke twins. They're back, and they've got a bunch of riders with them. They're driving off a whole herd of cattle." Rip's jaw clenched, and he exchanged a glance with Jack and Spotty. "How many?" "I don't know," Tommy said, his voice trembling. 10, maybe 15. They're armed, Rip. And they ain't looking to talk." Rip turned to Jack, his expression grim. "Looks like we've got our work cut out for us." Jack nodded, his hand instinctively dropping to the revolver at his hip. "Let's ride." The three men mounted up and rode hard for the north pasture, the dust kicking up behind them as they galloped across the open range. As they crested a rise, they saw the herd of cattle being driven toward the horizon, a group of riders flanking them. The Burke twins were at the front, their faces set in grim determination. Rip reined in his horse and raised a hand to signal a halt. "We'll split up," he said, his voice low but firm. "Jack, you take the left flank. Spotty, you're with me. We'll cut 'em off before they reach the canyon." Jack nodded, his eyes hard. "Let's move." They spurred their horses forward, the thunder of hooves echoing across the prairie. As they closed the distance, the Burke twins turned and saw them coming. Kurt Burke raised a hand, signaling the riders to stop, and the group wheeled around to face Rip and his men. "Well, well," Kurt called, his voice dripping with mockery. "If it ain't the new boss. Come to give us a send-off." Rip reined in his horse, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "You're not going anywhere, Kurt. Not with those cattle." Kurt sneered, his hand inching toward his gun. "You think you can stop us? You're outnumbered, Campbell. And we ain't in the mood to play nice." Rip's gaze didn't waver. "I'm giving you one chance to turn around and ride out. Take it, or things are gonna get ugly." For a moment, no one moved. Then Kurt's hand flashed toward his gun, but before he could draw, Rip's Colt was in his hand, the barrel leveled at Kurt's chest. "Don't," Rip said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'd hate to have to shoot you in front of your brother." The tension in the air was palpable, but slowly Kurt lowered his hand. "You'll regret this, Campbell," he spat. "You mark my words." Rip holstered his gun, his expression calm. "Maybe. But for now, you've got two choices. You can ride out peacefully, or I can throw you out. What's it gonna be?" The twins exchanged a glance, then turned and stalked toward their horses, their faces dark with anger. The other riders watched in silence as they mounted up and rode out, their dust trail fading into the distance. Rip turned to the remaining hands, his voice firm. "Anyone else got a problem with me running this ranch?" No one spoke. After a moment, one of the older cowhands stepped forward, his hat in his hands. "We're with you, Rip. Just tell us what you need." Rip nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good. Let's get to work." As the men dispersed, Jack rode up beside Rip, his expression thoughtful. "You handled that well." Rip glanced at him, his expression softening. "I had to. This ranch, this town, it's worth fighting for." The end.